So let's look at the level of development in a country by looking at the birth rate, the death rate, the infant mortality rate, as well as net migration, and what those measures mean in a country, as well as the causes of how those measures can change. And then we're going to look at the concept of optimum population, and finally finish with a little discussion on how urbanization patterns change depending on a country's level of development. So let's get started. So how are development indicators measured? Well, demographers are people who study changes in the structure of human populations, and they're the ones that go out and pick an indicator and figure out ways to measure that data. And so the first thing we can measure is something called the birth rate. It's the number of live births per thousand of the population in 1 year. So of every 1,000 people, how many infants are being born and are alive and well. The death rate is the number of deaths per thousand of the population in 1 year. So for every 1,000 people in 1 year, how many of them pass away? The infant mortality rate is the number of deaths of children aged under 1 per thousand live births in 1 year. Okay, so if there are children that are born, for every 1,000 kids that are born within 1 year, how many of those children pass away? That's the infant mortality rate. Net migration is the difference between immigration, which is people coming into the country, and emigration, which is people exiting the country. And you can remember that because in starts with I and exit starts with E. So the natural decrease or increase in population is the difference between the number of live births and the number of deaths. If the number of live births exceeds the number of deaths, then there's a natural increase in population. If the number of live births are under the number of deaths, then there's a natural decrease in population. So how does population change? Well, you'll notice that as a country develops, its population patterns are different. And so death rate is inversely related to development. And this makes sense because as a country develops, it's got better healthcare, it has better education, sanitation, housing, and nutrition. So all of these factors help people live longer. And at the same time, there are also factors that allow an economy to be more productive. The birth rate is also inversely related, even more so to development. And the big reason is because there's an increasing number of women in the labor force, which positively adds to economic growth. And also with countries that are more developed, there are usually rising costs of living, and these costs of living likely are rising at a rate faster than the wages of most people. And also there's declining infant mortality, right? So back in the day when infant mortality was higher, people would have multiple children to ensure that the lineage continues. But nowadays, if I can have one child, maybe two children, and both of them grow up healthy, then I'm good to go, right? I'm happy about that. And so declining infant mortality rate is also one reason why the birth rate is inversely related to development. Now, high income developed countries experience declines in population unless they have positive net immigration. And this makes sense because the birth rate is more inversely related to development than the death rate. And so in this situation then, if we are a country that is expanding very, very, very quickly, then assuming net migration is zero, the population would eventually start to decline. And that's really bad news in the long term because a declining population means that one day the economy might stop growing at the pace which it has been growing in the previous decade. And so countries that are in this situation usually relax immigration laws so more people can come into the country. And so they want to maintain a stable increase in population. Low development countries usually have higher, larger increases in population. And the reason is because children need to support parents, right? Back in the day, when our economy or whatever economy you're in is primarily a primary sector economy, we can have more kids so our kids can help out on the field, right? Now, low development countries also have a lack of birth control, and this might be because of cost issues, it might be because of accessibility issues. They also have low costs of living, right? And so bringing up a child in the United States has a very different cost than bringing up a child in a developing country. There's also a low education level in women, and a low education level in women implies that they're not joining the labor force. And so as a result, the natural result of that is more children are born. Modern day women are choosing to either have one kid or have no kids, and that's a personal choice. And low development countries also have high infant mortality, and so parents are incentivized to have more children just in case. Now, there's a concept called dependency ratios that we're going to look at, and low development countries have high dependency ratios. A dependency ratio is the proportion of the economically inactive compared to the labor force. So compared to everyone in the labor force, how many people are economically inactive? And somebody that is economically inactive, maybe under the age of 15, not working, or over the age of 65, also not working, they're retired, and anybody that is unable to work. And so on this graph over here, you see that some countries, the bluer the country is, the higher the dependency ratio. And so you'll notice here that developing countries have higher dependency ratios in general. The reason is because large amounts of economically dependent youth depend on the income of working adults in these low development countries. Now, high income and development countries can also have high dependency ratios. And that's because large amounts of economically dependent seniors are now depending on a small number of the working population. And this comes about because of an aging population due to the declining death rates and birth rates. And so this makes sense. If death rates are declining, then there are more and more seniors. If birth rates are declining, then there are less and less young people. And it's always the working population of today that are funding the pensions of the seniors who are no longer working today. And so increasing healthcare and pension costs can incentivize governments to raise the retirement age. And on the right, you'll see a bunch of people in France protesting because in 2023, French President Macron brought forward a motion for a 2-year increase in the retirement age from 62 to 64. So people took to the streets to protest this idea because they didn't like it. Now that brings us to the question, is there an optimum population, right? So like if we've got a low development country with high dependency ratio and we've got high development countries going into situations with high dependency ratios, then is there a such thing as this optimum population that kind of maximizes the income per head? And so the people in that country's welfare are maximized. So the optimum population is defined as the size of population that maximizes GDP per head at a given level of technology and with existing factors of production. The existence of the optimum population is a debatable idea, and if it exists, then most economists agree that this number, whatever it is not fixed over time. In fact, you'll notice that technology and efficiency improvements have allowed the Earth to sustain larger amounts of people. Also, discovery of new factors of production can also help sustain a larger amount of people. Now, the idea is that if we are below an optimum population, then there's increasing returns to increasing the population size. And so the Earth is, in this case, underpopulated. Now, if we're above the optimum population, there's decreasing returns. So that means the next person that is going to be born will marginally add less to the population than the last person. Will marginally add less income and output. And so in this situation, the population were overpopulated. Okay. And so there's an idea, right, by conservationists, and conservationists are people that value sustainability in the environment. And they argue that we should prioritize sustainability over economic growth now. But there are others who believe sustainability problems can be solved with future improvements in technology. An example of that might be the move from petrol cars to electric cars. Now, development and changes in urbanization is also a topic we want to talk about. If a country has low income per head, they tend to have higher rural to urban migration because many people still live in rural areas. And so in this situation, we've identified that if somebody lives in an urban area, they can enjoy a higher standard of living because there are more goods and services available in urban areas. And also because the income in urban areas is usually higher than that of the rural areas. But the caveat is that this puts pressures on schools and puts pressure on the infrastructure and housing in urban areas. Now, if we're looking at a country with high income per head, then they already have many people living in urban areas, and so the urban population growth is slower. In some cases, technological advancements might even enable people to work from home in rural areas. So you might even have people that prefer being away from the city and the noise. And because they're able to work remotely, they do, and they move away. So if we compare the urbanization in China and in the United States, you'll notice that in the 1980s, China's urbanization was just close to 20%, and today it sits at 60-something%. Which, if you look at the urbanization in the United States, and we compare the same time period, in the 1980s, its urbanization was 75%, and today it sits around at 80%. So one thing you notice is that China was a country that developed quite quickly, and its urbanization increased a lot in a short amount of time. Whereas for the United States, in the 1980s, the country was already quite urbanized, and so the urbanization increases are much slower.